Hey everybody, Mr. Regan here, and today we're going to be breaking down how we're going to be writing the 5 different sections for our internship proposal, along with looking at how the 5 sections of the proposal will be evaluated by Nisha Carr and the company that she works for, the International Disaster Aid Committee. We'll be looking at kind of what the focus of each of the 5 parts are, and then how to go about making sure we're successful when developing our proposal. So, first and foremost, let's talk about the 5 parts of our proposal. Our proposal is going to focus on what pod design is optimal for bringing aid to natural disaster victims. In order to answer this big focus question, the 5 parts that we'll have will start with the introduction. The introduction will be your pod design claim, or in other words, the pod design itself and the different results that we can expect to get if we use this pod within the International Disaster Aid Committee. The next 3 parts are going to be your body paragraph 1, 2, and 3. Each body paragraph is going to focus on how you minimize one of the criteria. So, for example, body paragraph number 1 is how you went about minimizing shell damage to create your optimal design. Body paragraph 2, how did you minimize cargo damage? Body paragraph 3, how did you minimize costs? Finally, the conclusion. The conclusion will be the big wrap up where you really talk about your pod design decisions. What sort of things did you choose to do, focus on, and create when coming to your final design choice? Now, each of these sections is going to be broken down into multiple subsections, starting with the introduction. So, your pod claim. The claim itself will focus on what is the optimal pod design, criteria results, and drop results for the problem our SupplyDrop pods solves. So for this, you're focusing on essentially what did you build your pod with? What would be the costs, the cargo damage, and the pod damage if we were to use it? And then what would be the drop results, again, if we were to use it, so the mass, the velocity, and the impact force. To answer this big focus question, we're going to have 3 parts: the opening summary, the optimal pod design and drop results, and the pod criteria and results. So in your proposal, your claim will start with an opening summary. What background information do you need to present to show your reader you best understand the problem and how the pod is the solution? This is where you show them you're an expert on the problem and that we didn't just go through the motions of creating pods in the sim for fun. What are we trying to do and why is it important? The second thing you'll talk about is your optimal pod design and drop results. So what are the pod building details? So this is where you'll talk about what did you use for your shell? What did you use for your add-ons and so on? And what are those drop results? So if we were to drop it, what would be the overall mass of it? What would be the velocity as it drops? And lastly, what would be the impact force when it collides? This is going to give your readers your overall claim in terms of what you feel is your optimal design and what they can expect when it's dropped. Finally, the pod criteria and results. What are the 3 criteria used to determine if your pod was optimal? And what criteria results did you get when testing your pod? So this is where you introduce, here's how you know that my pod's successful. Here are my 3 criteria. And here are the results of those 3 criteria. So this is where you'll talk about, here's the cost, here's the pod damage, and here is the cargo damage. So when your reader is done with your introduction, they'll know exactly, hey, here's what makes you an expert on the problem. Here's the solution to your problem. And here's how we know your problem is successful based on the results. This will be your lead-in or your introduction, where obviously your claim is the focal point. And the next sections will be your body paragraphs, where you support that claim. So again, you'll have 3 body paragraphs, each one focusing on the following. How did you minimize the 3 criteria to create an optimal design? So in your first body paragraph, you'll focus on shell damage. How did you minimize shell damage to make your optimal design? For that first body paragraph, the evidence that you're going to be using is, number 1, Nisha's feedback. So that can be your individual feedback she gave you or the overall data we collected from the team. Your iterative tests. What kind of tests did you run and how it's the best test compared to others? Articles you read. So this is where you pull in the science behind what sort of materials you use or decisions you made so that you were able to minimize, in this case, shell damage. And then finally, your drop data. This again is referring to your mass, your velocity, and your impact force. How did you Minimize shell damage as you look to bring those down or get certain results for those things. And last but not least, reasoning. This is the big one. How does your evidence show that this is the best way to minimize each of the three criteria for your optimal design? This is where you focus on this idea of optimal design. What makes your design best? Okay. Why is it the best for our natural disaster victims? Why is it the best based on your priorities? Why is it the best based on your results? Why is it best overall? Now, you're going to use the same type of evidence and have the same type of reasoning, but for each of the body paragraphs. So though it's going to seem very repetitive, okay, it's going to have a different focus for each paragraph. So obviously, again, paragraph 1, minimizing shell damage. What is the evidence to show that you minimize your shell damage to create an optimal design? What's that reasoning? Why is this optimal? Same with cargo damage. What evidence do you have to show that you were able to minimize cargo damage for this design? And again, reasoning, what makes that optimal or best? And again, finally, minimizing pod costs. Again, what is the evidence that shows you were able to minimize pod costs for this optimal design? And finally, the reasoning. Okay, why is this the overall best? You're then going to finalize your overall proposal with your conclusion, your pod design decisions. What decisions were made throughout the design cycle that led to this being the optimal design solution? So how did you go about deciding this was the best? How did you go about testing and making decisions in the sim for this to be your best design? So first and foremost, there are 3 sections here that you'll look to focus on to answer our focus questions. The first one being prioritizing the criteria. Okay, explain which of the 3 criteria are the most and least important to minimizing when creating your optimal design and why. So this is where you focus on, here's how I prioritize my criteria. Shell damage was first, pod damage was first, cost was first, and why. Why are those things first, second, and third? Design trade-offs. Okay, this is where we focus on what sort of trade-offs did you get that allowed you to be successful when creating your optimal design. Explain the specific trade-offs that were made when building your optimal design that led to your design criteria and results. So, did you trade off that small parachute for that large parachute? Did you trade off 10% packing peanuts for 30% packing peanuts? What were those trade-offs that allowed you to be successful? And finally, closing statements, okay? This is where you wrap up everything and prove to your reader not only are you an expert, but you can be trusted. Create a final statement that shows your work can be trusted as a mechanical engineer and that your design is in the best interest of the people it's trying to help. Again, this is where you show that you are focusing on the important things, the things that are going to help our natural disaster victims, and again, why you should be trusted overall when making this decision. So when you're done, when you're done with your overall proposal, you'll have answered the question, what pod design is optimal for bringing aid to natural disaster victims. You'll have an introduction with 3 questions answering that big focus question. You'll have a body paragraph with 3 to 4 pieces of reasoning and evidence. A second one, 3 to 4 pieces of reasoning and evidence. A third one, 3 to 4 pieces of evidence and reasoning. And then your conclusion with 3 questions you use to answer the focus question overall. So this is going to be a very large overall write-up for this internship. When you submit it, I will be grading the 5 parts, okay? Starting with our rubric components, we have the introduction, we have the very first criteria, so minimizing shell damage, the second criteria, minimizing cargo damage, the third, minimizing pod costs, and the fourth, our conclusion. For each of those, I will be looking for different evidence, different reasoning, and your overall data used to support the idea that your pod is optimal for natural disaster victims. The more accurate and detailed your write-up is, the farther left you'll see that we'll move over on the rubric. So what do I mean by that? Well, on the far left, you'll see we have the exceed section that shows you went above and beyond. The meet section, which shows you argued a solid proposal. The approaching section, which shows that you had certain evidence and reasoning that maybe didn't make sense or questions that weren't answered with good detail. Beginning level, which shows that you have maybe one or so piece of evidence and reasoning that makes sense, and incomplete, where we're missing certain things. So again, the more accurate we can be with the evidence we're using and detailed when explaining the reasoning or explaining the background information, the farther left we'll move on the rubric for each section. Each section will have its own overall grade, so you might get exceeds for the introduction, meets for the first body paragraph, approaching for the second, beginning for the third, and let's say incomplete for the conclusion. And we'll take the average of those 5 sections to get your overall grade. So that is the 5 sections we're writing in the proposal, along with how you're going to be evaluated looking at the general rubric. So go ahead and take a second when looking at your proposal survey. Do we understand the 5 sections we're writing? Do we understand how we're going to be evaluated? Go ahead and place your X in the survey and reach out if you need help. Otherwise, good luck.